Today's keynote is about maternal and child health during conflict and peace times, and it is given by a guest that could not come here directly due to some other administrative issues. His name is Rodrigo Moreno-Serra. He is associate professor at the Center of Health Economics and full team leader of the Global Health Team at the Center of Health Economics in New York. And I'm very happy that he can join us today. Hello, can't see me. I think now you can see me. Hi.
Yes, hello, I can see you now, Thomas. Yeah, thank you.
It's great. Thank you for coming.
No, thank you for the invitation. Yeah, great to see everyone as well in the room. Okay, thank you. And I hope that you are hearing me and seeing me okay. So if there are any issues, please let me know. Hello, everyone, and many thanks for coming to this presentation. As Thomas said, my name is Rodrigo Moreno-Serra. I'm an associate professor of global health economics at the Center for Health Economics of the University of York in the UK. It's a great pleasure for me to be talking to you today and take part in this meeting of the Austrian Health Economics Association. I feel very honored by the invitation of the organizing committee, and my apologies for not being able to be there in person in beautiful Vienna to be talking to you and enjoying a little bit of the city lights there. So, but I still hope that this virtual presentation will still be of interest to you all. Well, the broad topic of my talk today is the consequences of conflict and fragility to health and health systems, which is a topic that health economists have become more and more active in recent years. And I'm going to present specifically some results of research that I've conducted for the specific case of the civil conflict in Colombia. And these results, they are part of a larger research project that I led and finished recently that was conducted with partners at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, in Colombia, and also in partnership with local stakeholders, including the Ministry of Health in Colombia and a local provincial government. So specifically, more specifically, the topic for my talk today is the consequences of conflict reduction of the peace agreement in Colombia on maternal and child health. So this is the specific area that I'll be talking to you today within a larger project. So just to give you a little bit of background as to why those issues should matter for us health economists. More than 135 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance in our world today. And the vast majority of these people are in that situation because of armed conflicts. And among armed conflicts, protracted conflicts have become the norm recently. There isn't a single definition of what a protracted conflict means, but most international organizations use that term as meaning conflict lasting for 7 or more years. And as you very well know, there are plenty of these conflicts around in the world nowadays. So I mentioned some examples there in these slides. And there is some evidence that suggests that there are negative effects of conflict events on the health of individuals exposed to these events. And those effects, they come from direct and indirect channels, directly because people are affected directly by violence, so they are killed or maimed because of being exposed to violence. But also because of indirect effects coming from issues like, for example, damage to healthcare infrastructure, the lack of access to health services, because, for example, security concerns or deficient transportation links, for example. And this is important from an economic perspective because in most cases, and this is the case also in Colombia, the people most affected by conflict violence tend to be the poor and rural. So basically, conflicts act as an instrument to exacerbate poverty and inequalities through channels like, for example, the need for people to sell assets or borrow money in order to afford for what us health economists call catastrophic health expenditures, but also reduced ability to work and reduce productivity. So there are quite a few economic consequences coming from this exposure to violence. But the evidence about, even if there is some evidence about the effects of conflict on health, this evidence is actually rather limited in terms of its robustness. And the causal links are often questionable. And this is because many studies have issues of data availability. So it's not always that you have, for example, panel data for people before and after a given conflict to have a look at. Many studies use methods that might be challenged. So, for example, many studies just use simple before and after comparisons for the same group of people before and after the conflict without an appropriate comparison group. And one thing that happens quite often is that studies have focused on short-term conflicts or short-term acute conflicts, in which the violence is very intense, but it happens in a very limited time span. And that leads to implications and learnings, lessons that are not immediately relevant for situations where you have conflicts lasting for years and years, like in Colombia, for example, where you have institutions working alongside the conflict, so health system stays working, and you also have a situation where the level of violence varies quite a lot over time. So in our case, we use features of the Colombian peace process, temporal and geographical variation in conflict levels, and we ask, what is the magnitude of the health impacts of long-term conflict reduction for maternal and child health? And this is important not only from an academic perspective, but also from a real policy perspective in Colombia, because the peace agreement is a relatively young one. It was signed in 2016, and it's being threatened by different areas of the political spectrum there, particularly around election time, with people expressing dissatisfaction as to how the peace agreement has been working. So it's important to show that the current peace agreement has had already benefits in order to gather public support around it. So to do that and to answer the questions that we pose, we bring two innovations to the table. So one is that we use ceasefires with regression discontinuity to address the causality issues between conflict and health. And we also use very rich data, which actually is not available for previous studies, which we look at all pregnancies that happen in Colombia over a very long period. So it's an entire population that we're able to look at, unlike previous studies. So just to give you some background now to the Colombian civil conflict itself, for those of you who are not familiar with it, Colombia has faced an internal armed conflict for more than 6 decades now. There are or were different armed groups on different ideological extremes. So more on the left wing side of things, you have a number of guerrilla groups. The largest one, the most important one in the history of the Colombian conflict is the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which in its heyday actually reached about 10,000 members. And then there are a number of other smaller groups like ELN and EPL that they focus in other areas of the countries, and they tend to be smaller, and some of them are still active to this day. On the right-wing side of things, there are a number of paramilitary groups, the most important one being the AUC. And these groups, they were created by the large landowners of Colombia to try and protect themselves against incursions from the guerrilla groups. But very quickly, these organizations became these very large and unhinged criminal organizations that became involved in kidnapping, extortion, civilian massacres, and drug trafficking, pretty much like the guerrilla groups themselves. And then the third main actor that you have there is the Colombian army, which in itself has been accused in the past of a number of violations of human rights, civilian massacres as well, and it's been involved in a number of other questionable events and violent events as well. So this these maps, they show the geographical distribution of conflict events by perpetrator, by armed actor in Colombia between 2000 and 2007. So here on the left-hand side, you have the distribution of conflict events that are related to the FARC. So these maps show municipalities in Colombia, and the municipalities where you have color are the ones that where the FARC were actively involved in conflict events taking place in those municipalities. In the middle, you have the ELN, the activities related to the ELN, which is the smaller guerrilla group that I mentioned before. And here on the right-hand side, you have violent events related to the AUC, the largest paramilitary group. And the intensity of violence here is, it reflects the number of conflict events that took place in a given municipality and that are related to that particular armed group, in this case, the FARC, for example. And there are two takeaways that we can take from these maps. The first one is that conflict intensity varied quite a lot across the country. So, for example, you have areas of Colombia where there is no conflict recorded at all. And that's basically because these are very sparsely populated areas. So they belong to the Amazon, for example, where there are only a few people there. But then there are other areas where you have quite a lot of conflict events happening over time. And the second main takeaway of these maps is that the armed groups, they tended to focus in specific areas of the country. So, for example, the FARC, they dominated quite a lot of the territory. And then you had the ELN, another armed group, that tended to focus in other areas. So not the areas that were the FARC were particularly active, and the same for the AUC. And this is important because the source of variation in conflict intensity that we use for our work is based on the signing of a peace agreement between the government and the FARC. So we should expect that the signing of that peace agreement would affect the levels of violence, particularly in those municipalities where the FARC were particularly active, so where they were the dominant actor. Now, to give you some more background now to the timeline of the Colombian peace process. So after a number of failed attempts by previous governments, the government of Juan Manuel Santos, they started secret conversations with the FARC in Havana, Cuba, and that was in October 2012. So that was not known to the public, and it was very secretive conversations, and only with the FARC. And after the conversations started and leading to the signing of the peace agreement in 2016, there were a number of ceasefires that were declared, the majority of them unilaterally by the FARC. So they were declared by the FARC as a gesture of goodwill, particularly around election times. So to allow the elections to move freely. But then very soon, the attacks would resume. So the government would attack FARC positions or vice versa. So the majority of these ceasefires, they were very short-lived, like these ones that I show here. So we shouldn't expect those very short-lived ceasefires to have any effects on conflict intensity violence. And therefore, we wouldn't expect them to have any sort of effects on health outcomes either. But then there were 3 ceasefires that were declared later on that had longer duration. The first one was one ceasefire declared in December 2014, unilaterally by the FARC. And this one lasted for 2 months. The second one is a ceasefire declared, again, unilaterally by the FARC. And this ended up being the definitive ceasefire because it was when the peace talks really intensified between the government and the FARC, and the government decided to respect that ceasefire by not attacking FARC positions. So this was ended up being a very important one. And the third one that happened just before the signing of the peace agreement was in August 2016. And this one was a bilateral one. So in this one, the government joined and said, we're not taking any actions against the FARC. And basically, the FARC continue to respect their own ceasefire, and that was the last ceasefire that was taken just before the signing of the peace agreement in November 2016. So for our work, we are particularly interested in these 3 later ceasefires because these ones are the ones that lasted for longer, that we could expect them to have an effect on conflict intensity and thereby on health outcomes of those populations. So we use those ceasefires as sources of variation in conflict intensity to assess the effect of exposure to conflict events during pregnancy on pregnancy outcomes in Colombia. So we focus particularly on the population of pregnant women in Colombia. And we do that by collecting data for a cohort of all single pregnancies in Colombia between January 2013 and December 2017. So this is a total of over 3.2 million pregnancies, and this is the universe of pregnancies in Colombia. This is not a representative sample of the population like previous studies. This is the whole universe. And we're able, with our data, to construct outcomes that previous studies haven't been able to look at. So the first outcome that we construct with our data is perinatal deaths. So this is basically deaths occurring between 22 weeks after pregnancy and 7 days after birth. And because we have information about the date of birth of the baby, and we also have information about the utilization of healthcare during the mother's pregnancy, we are able to estimate with relative precision the likely pregnancy date of that mother. So we can construct the full history of pregnancy for that mother, and because of that, we are able to look at fetal deaths as well. So we're able to look at miscarriages, so deaths of baby before 22 weeks after pregnancy, after the date of pregnancy, and stillbirths, which are deaths after 22 weeks of pregnancy. And this is important because unlike previous studies, we're then looking at the broader consequences of conflict, and we are not restricted like previous analyses to a selected sample of live births. We are able to look at the consequences of conflict in utero as well, not only for live births. So previous studies focus on child mortality, for example, or birth weight, but that's for a selected sample of live births. So we were able to construct those pregnancy histories and look at those effects, including in utero. In terms of conflict violence, we collect data from the Colombian National Center for Historical Memory, and this is the most authoritative source of conflict events in Colombia. They collect their data from a number of sources. So they collect data from official records, from government records, but also victim accounts. They cross-reference those as well, and they collect data from newspaper articles and other written sources, or journalists and so on. So it's really nice and very complete source of data. And from that, we take conflict events, so the total number of conflict events, and also conflict events related to the FARC specifically, per municipality and day between 2013 and 2018. And the events that they record is everything, basically. So they include murders, kidnappings, landmines, extortions, threats, sexual violence, and so on and so forth. So by actor involved. So it's pretty complete and a pretty interesting source of data. And we use that data to construct our exposure measure, so the measure of exposure to conflict events. So that measure is the total number of conflict events to which the mother is exposed during pregnancy. So we know the birth date of the baby, we know the likely pregnancy date, so we can attribute to that particular mother the number of conflict events that took place in the municipality of residence of that mother. So for example, in this case, this mother in the municipality of residence that she was living during her pregnancy, there were 5 events taking place. So this is the exposure measure that we look. So we consider that mother as being exposed to 5 conflict events in her municipality of residence, and that's our exposure measure. Now, as I mentioned before, because we shouldn't expect a conflict, a peace agreement that was signed between the government and the FARC to affect conflict intensity levels in municipalities where the FARC wasn't present or wasn't the main actor, then we define categories of municipalities according to FARC presence between 2000 and 2017. So we look at FARC-related conflict events, and we define 4 categories of municipalities that we look at. The first category of municipalities that we're interested in is what we call the P90 municipalities. So these are the ones that are in the 90th percentile of FARC-related conflict events. So these are the municipalities that were most affected by FARC-related conflict violence. So these were the municipalities where the FARC were dominant and they were very active in terms of number of conflict events. The second, and these are the municipalities in red in the map here. Then we define the second category, which are the municipalities in the P75 category. So these are municipalities in the 75th percentile of FARC-related conflict events. And again, these are municipalities highly affected by conflict events related to the FARC. And these are the ones depicted in orange in the map here. And then we contrast these municipalities with 2 other categories that we define. The first one is the 0 category. These are the municipalities without conflict events during the period. These are depicted as light yellow here. And as I mentioned before, these are municipalities normally very sparsely populated, and thereby there weren't any conflict events recorded during time. And the fourth category that we create is other. So basically other municipalities not included in the categories above. And those municipalities are municipalities for which there was conflict, but conflict was mostly related to the activities of other groups like the ELN, EPL, or even the paramilitary groups. So for our work, we're particularly interested in these groups of municipalities. So these are the ones that, because they were dominated by the FARC, and before the agreement, they were the ones observing high levels of FARC-related conflict violence, that we would expect the peace agreement to have more of an effect on these municipalities in terms of violence intensity. Now, for our estimation strategy, we use a regression discontinuity analysis, in which we compare women starting their pregnancies just before and just after the FARC ceasefires. We use as our treatment variable the pregnancy date. So that's the variable that we use for the cohort assignment. And we have this continuous distribution of pregnancy dates, and we compare that with the ceasefire dates. So the ceasefire dates are our thresholds. And we expect that those thresholds, those ceasefire dates, will change discontinuously the probability of conflict exposure at the threshold. So we would expect that mothers starting their pregnancies just before the dates of the ceasefires will have a probability of exposure to violence that will be different from mothers starting their pregnancies just after the ceasefire. And we hope, we expect that probability to change discontinuously at the threshold. Now, for regression discontinuity to work well in our case, we need to have an idea that 2 assumptions, there are basic assumptions, they actually hold in our case. The first assumption is that there is no manipulation of treatment assignment, which is in our case is the pregnancy date. So this means basically that in our context, there shouldn't be the possibility that the mother is determining their pregnancy date specifically based on the ceasefire dates, that they wouldn't expect, for example, or wait for the ceasefire date in order to get pregnant. The second assumption that is important to ascertain in our case is that there is continuity of baseline variables around the threshold, so that mothers around the threshold, so the mothers getting pregnant just before and just after the ceasefire, they are comparable in baseline variables, so that the baseline characteristics are randomly distributed around the threshold, and therefore we would expect that potential outcomes are also randomly distributed around the thresholds. So these are assumptions. They cannot be directly tested, but if they are violated, then there are directly testable things that we can look at the data and we can look more formally for. So if they are violated, we should be able to see some consequences in our data, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later, because we test extensively to see whether our results are likely causal. So we adopt a fuzzy regression discontinuity design. We estimate intention to treat effects. Basically, we are comparing the average outcomes, the pregnancy outcomes for mothers starting their pregnancies just before and just after the ceasefires. And because we are looking at a bandwidth around the threshold, it's important to check the stability of results according to the functional form that we pick. So basically, we compare a number of potential regression formats. So we estimate our models using local linear regression, so more semi-parametric, non-parametric sort of estimation strategy. But we also look at parametric regression with first, second, and third order polynomials. We estimate an optimal bandwidth around the thresholds using an established procedure, but we also test our results to different bandwidth options. So the farther away you go from the threshold, you might increase the precision of your estimates because you're looking at more mothers. But at the same time, you risk introducing some bias there because you're looking for mothers that are getting farther and farther away in terms of comparability, or might be getting farther away in terms of comparability. We also test formally for the possibility of mothers manipulating the pregnancy date based on the ceasefire dates. And we do falsification tests with zero in other municipalities, because we shouldn't expect to see any changes in violence intensity in those municipalities, and therefore we shouldn't expect to see any impacts of the peace agreement on health outcomes in the zero and other municipalities. So this is well, our first task for our analysis is to check whether there are any discontinuities in the levels of violence around the dates of the ceasefires. So this graph here, it shows the dates of ceasefires that I just mentioned and the date of the peace agreement. So this vertical line here is the first ceasefire date that was declared in 2014. This is the second one, the July 2015, that was declared by the FARC and that ended up being the definitive one. This is the third one, the bilateral ceasefire. And this is the signing of the red line is the signing of the formal peace agreement in 2016. And just and each dot in this figure is a cohort of women who started their pregnancies at the same date. So basically, these are cohorts defined by pregnancy dates. The first thing that we can see here is that the levels, the average exposure to conflict events was decreasing sharply during the time of the peace talks in the Havana. And when we just observe the dots here, the only ceasefires for which we might see some discontinuity are the first two. So there might be some discontinuity around the threshold, the first threshold here, the first ceasefire, and the second one. But when we look at the third ceasefire, it seems like the violence levels were already pretty low because of the previous ceasefires declared, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of discontinuity in violence levels around the threshold. So it just visually inspecting this figure, it seems like the main candidates for us to look at would be the first two ceasefires to look for discontinuities in violence levels. But then we do a more formal test of discontinuities, and what we find is that so we estimate our regression discontinuity models, and what we find is that the only ceasefire for which we can confidently say that there was a discontinuous change in the probability of exposure to conflict is ceasefire 2, the one in July 2015. So we estimate that there was a reduction of about 0.2 conflict events that the mother was exposed to during pregnancy if they started their pregnancy after the ceasefire. And the same if we look at just at FARC-related conflict events. So if we look at total events or FARC-related conflict events, this is the only ceasefire for which we find a discontinuity in the probability of being exposed to conflict events. That doesn't happen for ceasefire 1 or ceasefire 3. So the first lesson from our empirical work is that if there is any sort of hope for health impacts in our population, this would probably come from ceasefire 2, which is the one that actually induced a change in the probability of violence exposure. And we find the same thing. We focus in the municipalities that we are particularly interested in, the municipalities, the P90 and the P75 category. So for these ones is where we find actually the largest reductions in conflict intensity levels. So we find effect of around a reduction of 10% in the average exposure, or rather the probability that a mother will be exposed to a conflict event after the ceasefire, the ceasefire of July 2015. So this is interesting. It shows that this particular ceasefire has a particular effect on conflict intensity in these categories of municipalities, but not in municipalities in the other categories. And this is in line with what we expected to find, right? So we expected to see that the peace agreement with the FARC would change levels of violence, particularly in those municipalities where the FARC were active before the ceasefire and before the peace agreement. And this figure just shows exactly what I was saying, that there seems to be this discontinuity, this jump in conflict intensity or conflict exposure before and after this July 2015 ceasefire for these two groups of municipalities. Now, having determined that there was this discontinuity in conflict events, the next task is to look as to whether there was any effects on health outcomes. And this is what we estimate using our regression discontinuity model. So we find that both for P90 and for P75 municipalities, there was a marked reduction in stillbirth deaths and perinatal deaths in those municipalities. For example, for P90 municipalities, we find that there was a reduction of about 9.5 deaths per 1,000 pregnancies in those municipalities. And for perinatal deaths, we found that there is a reduction of about 10 perinatal deaths per 1,000 pregnancies in the P90 municipalities after the ceasefire, so after the reduction in violence levels. And we find, again, statistically significant point estimates for P75 municipalities. But what is quite interesting is that they seem to be a little bit smaller in size, which might be hitting at some dose-response relationship there as well, which we could expect, right? So we could expect that in those municipalities which were the P90, where the reduction in conflict intensity levels was higher, that those improvements in health would be also higher as well. So as I mentioned to you, I mean, in order for us to have some confidence that those results are causal, there are two assumptions that we need to check. The first one is that there is no manipulation in the pregnancy date in the treatment assignment variable. So we look at basically what we have to check here is whether there is a continuous distribution of pregnancy dates around the threshold, the ceasefire. And these two figures, they show the histogram of distribution of pregnancy dates for municipalities in P90, P75 categories. And just inspecting this figure, we don't see any particular jumps in pregnancy dates or women, waiting to become pregnant after the ceasefire here. So we don't see any discontinuities around. And this is just looking at the distribution, right? So this is just visual inspection. But we can do a more formal test, and there are established tests to look at that. And we apply the formal test of density of the treatment assignment variable, the pregnancy date, using the McCrary test. And this is basically a test to check whether there is a break in the density of pregnancy dates around the threshold. And we don't find, again, we don't find any evidence that we should reject the null hypothesis of there being a continuity of the distribution of pregnancy dates. So we find very high p-values here, showing that or indicating that there isn't any statistically significant break in the distribution of pregnancy dates just before or just after the ceasefire, our ceasefire. So in our main application, we look at a bandwidth of 14 days before and 14 days after the pregnancy dates, but we explore longer bandwidths and with the same results. So this is quite reassuring. And actually, it should be expected as well, intuitively, because there were plenty of ceasefires during this history of conflict in Colombia. So there is no reason for mothers to expect that that particular ceasefire would have been the one definitive and respected by all parties. There were plenty of other ceasefires that were, very short-lived, and so there was no particular reason for mothers to believe that this one was going to be the one that was going to be respected by everyone. So we check also our second assumption here, which is the continuity of the baseline variables around the threshold. So we look at a number of observable characteristics to check whether they are well balanced across the threshold. For those of you who are, familiar with randomized control trials, this is basically is analogous to checking whether after randomization the distribution of observable characteristics is well balanced for people in the treated and non-treated categories. So basically here we're looking at whether those characteristics are well balanced around the threshold for mothers giving birth just before and just after the ceasefire. And we looked at a number of observable characteristics. So age, health insurance status, so the three possibilities in Colombia. We look at education, marital status, whether the mother has children. And we don't find any evidence of imbalance in observable characteristics for mothers giving birth just before and just after the ceasefire. So this is reassuring evidence for us in terms that the observable characteristics and thereby potential outcomes are likely to be well balanced as well around the threshold, and we are comparing comparable people basically. And finally, this is the last table that I'm going to show is we do a number of sensitivity checks with different functional forms. So we look at linear, quadratic, and cubic functional forms. We vary the bandwidth where we're comparing women. So the 14 days before and after is the optimal bandwidth, but we also establish larger bandwidths to see whether the results change. And we find that the results for stillbirth deaths and perinatal mortality are pretty much stable over time. If anything, they tend to be more on the conservative side of things. But one interesting thing is that when we increase the bandwidth to 21 days or 28 days before and after the ceasefire, we find that these point estimates, they tend to become a little bit smaller. And this is interesting because it tends to show that the effects of the reduction in violence are particularly concentrated on the starting moments of pregnancy, so the initial periods of pregnancy rather than later down the line. So it seems to be that exposure to violence in the beginning of the pregnancy is particularly important for pregnancy outcomes at a later date. Oh, sorry, I lied to you. I said that was the last table. There is one last one. It's just to show that we do a falsification test as well. So we run our same regression discontinuity models, but instead of looking at the P90 and P75 municipalities, we look at those municipalities where we shouldn't expect any effect because the FARC were inactive there. And we find that there are no statistically significant effects there. So as we would expect, right? So those municipalities weren't, we couldn't find any changes in violence levels in those municipalities. Therefore, we shouldn't expect any health impacts. And that's exactly what we find. There is no evidence of there being a reduction in stillbirths or perinatal deaths in those municipalities. So this is quite reassuring. So in terms of conclusions of our work, the peace process then, it seems to have reduced the average of total conflict events to which women were exposed during pregnancy. And this, in turn, has resulted in reduced stillbirths and perinatal deaths in municipalities where the FARC were most active. And there seems to be a hint of a dose-response relationship, right? Municipalities where the FARC were most active, there seems to be a bigger effect in terms of health outcomes. And the question is, so what? So is that important beyond an academic perspective? Well, it turns out that it is. There is quite a lot of policy importance as well. So we presented evidence about these results to national and subnational policymakers during very challenging times for the peace accord in Colombia. So it was the election period last year, in which a number of people in a given part of the political spectrum were questioning the peace agreement. So it's important to show benefits. And I'm not claiming here that it was because of our evidence that the peace agreement still holds water, but it's important to show those results as evidence, robust evidence that it's already reaping benefits in terms of population health and provide some support to it. And this is also important economic consequences because the results that we find and the estimates that we find, they relate to municipalities that were most affected by violence, and these tend to be poor and rural and Colombia. So the health benefits are mainly accruing to populations that tend to be deprived in relative standards in the country. Now, just to talk a little bit about potential channels for the effects that we find. The first channel that has been quite documented in the literature is because of reduced exposure to violence is the reduction in maternal stress. So there is quite a lot of evidence showing that reduced maternal stress is important for pregnancy outcomes. And this could come from two pathways. The first one is that mothers are now exposed to less to traumatic events. So in the municipalities that we study, there was a very high prevalence of very traumatic events, like, for example, exposure to sexual violence and murders. So there is possibly a very direct effect in mothers being less affected by that. But also, there is a possibility of indirect effects because the decreasing violence in the community might have also contributed to decrease maternal stress, even for mothers that were not directly the target of violence. Just looking around and see that there is less violence around might contribute to decrease in stress and thereby improved outcomes. And there is some evidence, including the medical literature, showing that those neighborhood effects are important for pregnancy outcomes. But as I mentioned before, there are quite a few other pieces of research that we did in this larger project, and some of them also give us very interesting insights about what may be behind our results. So we did both more quantitative and qualitative work as well with partners in Colombia to look at possible pathways for changes in health outcomes before and after the peace agreement. And I'm going to mention very quickly two pieces of work that we did. So one is another quantitative piece analysis that we looked at demographic and health surveys in Colombia in 2005 and 2010 using pseudo-panel approach and difference analysis. And these are for representative samples of the entire Colombian population. And we found that exposure to one additional event, violent event during pregnancy, was associated with the increased probability of alcohol consumption by the mother, especially in urban areas, and reduced probability of mothers receiving prenatal care, particularly in rural areas. So one could expect that these sort of channels might be contributing as well, so that after the reduction in violence, so mothers improve their lifestyle, their behaviors, so their health-related behaviors by consuming less alcohol to cope, for example, with violence and with the effects of conflict. And also, we could expect that there is an increased probability after the reduction in violence of mothers receiving better prenatal care. And the qualitative work that we did, we found that a very common emerging theme from the analysis were issues related to frequent experience of sexual violence among women during the conflict, and also a high opportunity cost of mothers for obtaining timely health care. And this would be related, for example, not only to fear of being subject to violence, but also the opportunity cost of having to spend 1 or 2 days outside of their community and therefore outside of work and looking for healthcare to treat some health-related injury or conflict-related injury or health impact. Yeah, so this is basically what we do in our project. So this is now my turn just to say thank you for all the attention to this presentation. Really enjoying doing it. Hopefully you enjoyed it as well. And I stop there and look forward to the discussion in due course. So thank you very much.